Welcome to this first episode of this new podcast from the UCL Institute of Sustainable Resources. I'm Michael Grubb, Deputy Director of the Institute, where we aim to provide world-leading research, evidence, expertise, and training to respond to the sustainability challenges of our time. So our researchers contribute to policy debates around the world, and many students go on to take up positions in governments or companies, striving on how to manage and deliver transitions for the benefits of the people they serve and the planet more broadly. Now, this podcast offers a new platform for presenting and discussing issues relating to our research, which spans a whole wide range. It spans energy innovation systems, sustainability, circular economies analysis, climate finance, a number of other topics. For my part, I'm most involved in research on energy systems and the dynamics of transition towards new energy technologies and structures, ultimately to deliver benefits for all in the process of major transition in how we organise our energy systems. Now, our centre is an unusual venture. It's supported by a number of companies through philanthropic donations, looking to support research on how we better organise and manage the transition so that everybody benefits ultimately from what needs to be done. In particular, the prime focus at present is on the UK's energy and electricity transition, which is amongst the world's leading ones and a topic of real interest around the world as to the progress the UK has made. So for the opening podcast of this series, I'm delighted to be joined with Laura Sandys, CBE. She has many hats. She's chair of the Ofgem Innovate UK Energy Networks Innovation Task Force. She's a non-executive director at SSE Transmission, Highview Power, and a number of other aspects. She's also engaged with what's called the Energy Geeks group, which belies the fact that she and her colleagues are a highly influential group of what we might call potential disruptors in the system, which is perhaps something the system needs. So Laura, there are so many issues at play in the energy transition. Where would you like to start?
Well, firstly, Michael, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. And it's wonderful. UCL is really one of the leading academic institutions on energy and internationally, but certainly absolutely at the heart of UK development of UK energy policy. But I think we all know that there is a bit of a burning platform at the moment, and that is really the cost of energy to customers, and that being both domestic customers who are feeling the cost of living pinch very, very significantly, but also certainly for the commercial and industrial sector, where we have the highest electricity prices in the OECD. So I think we've got to start there, and maybe that builds a sort of new proposition for the energy sector. I love you all in the energy sector. However, it is often the case that we think that we exist because some higher being put us on this earth, right? Actually, we're here to serve. And I'm not sure that customers have always been put at the heart of either policy or practice or business in the energy sector. And I think we now are getting to a point where we're asking customers to do quite a lot of heavy lifting, that we have to change in many ways our ethos as well.
And I guess one of the things that strikes me is that the customers, and in fact, almost everyone in the energy industry, has inherited a system which was ultimately a product of engineering in the 20th century, big centralized power stations feeding through transmission just down to, pardon the phrase, dumb consumers at the end who couldn't do very much other than consume electricity. We then felt that wasn't working that well. 35 years ago, we privatised and liberalised the system, but it was one fundamentally based on fossil fuels. And that was the market design. That was the axis of competition. And we haven't really changed much fundamentally since then. And I think part of the reason we're in a build crisis is because we've added on some bits of layers on top of this system which were designed for a different world. It was designed for the last century, let's be honest.
But also totally different cost base. So what we've tried to do is to put a new renewable sector, which is very highly capital intensive, and we're trying to squeeze it into a fossil fuel paradigm, which is a commodity-based system. I mean, I don't know what you feel, but it sort of feels that we got the worst of all worlds now, because we're not actually understanding that we need to sweat that capital in a very different way. And we're trying to get these capital heavy assets to behave as if they were gas-fired power stations.
Well, certainly one of the big things that was fascinating as a researcher in the area is it took the energy crisis for many other people to wake up to the fact that the system we designed meant that gas set the price of electricity.
Yeah.
Now, on the surface, there were very good economic reasons for that. It's a bidding process. You need that last few megawatts to come online to make sure the lights stay on. But it took people by complete surprise. That meant in the energy crisis, by when we had half of the system that was no longer fossil fuel, actually 98% of the time you were paying the cost of gas. And that was doing all kinds of weird things to the finance in the sector, and including the fact that a number of those renewables had been built on the promise of getting the wholesale price plus a decent uplift. And frankly, I'm not surprised that people were pretty upset at the outcome, because they were paying an exorbitant cost for gas, for their heating, and for electricity, and a top up for renewables. And that actually, you stepped back and think, that did not really make sense.
And it sort of blew up some of the political consensus that we had. I mean, I think that was a tipping point when you started to see that there was a fragmentation around our net zero stroke renewable journey. Not for the right reasons, in my view, but because suddenly it became very much more part of the public discourse. And we ended up with such a shock when actually, unlike a lot of other countries in Europe, we had domestic supply that we controlled. And so that decoupling is going to be is absolutely fundamental in my view. And I know you've done a huge amount of work on it, from fossil fuels, so that we actually start pricing our energy appropriately. I did a big report ages ago called Recosting Energy. And it's just rethinking the system that, as you rightly say, is 35 years old, designed for a system that's been in existence for 100 years, where it's a new world. And that's what's exciting.
It's exciting. We've got to deal with all the frustrations. And I think it's worth, for a moment, deconstructing why our prices are so high. Believe me, they are really high. The UK prices are amongst the highest in the world, and that is a challenge for industry, a challenge for consumers. Often there's a challenge or debate we seem to have. Is it because of gas or is it because of renewables? To which you can also add, is it because we didn't have enough investment or we've had too much investment? Or is it because we've not got enough competition or because we've got too much competition? And sometimes I say, well, if you really look at it, it could be a little bit of all of those, because we haven't got the system to work effectively. Unquestionably, the big peaks were driven by gas. But as said, many people were paying, or many of the renewables were still getting a top up on top of very high wholesale prices. Some of those other areas are also relevant. I think in some areas we've got almost hyper competition, vast amounts of trading, and it's not obvious they actually add a lot to the economic value and may well do the opposite. And that kind of makes sense when you are dealing with an inherently volatile commodity with massive uncertainties, like what was happening to gas prices in the crisis. But with renewables, by and large, you know the costs. When you sign the contract and you built the thing.
This is actually under our control, and with agency that government and the regulator has to actually start to optimize our domestic supply. And I think that is where we have failed. We still haven't done what, Michael, you're suggesting always, is that we decouple the gas and renewables prices, because without that, things will not move forward.
So let me pick up on that, since you raised it explicitly, and it can get called by various names. People termed it a green power pool or variations thereof. And it's really not rocket science, right? It is basically, we now have a sizable and still growing pool of renewable energy where we know the basic cost structure, and yet it's incredibly difficult for people to actually access that energy, that ways that reflect the cost of that, because it is primarily all sold through the wholesale market. Some are with these add-ons. The others, the more recent ones, they're called contracts for difference under the terms. It can involve some money getting recycled back to consumers en masse. If basically the renewables are cheaper than wholesale, then actually you pay a little bit back to the suppliers, and the idea is they pass that on.
The idea is that they pass it on, Michael.
And also that is nothing like something which makes it easy for you, Laura, or a collection of consumers to say, well, we want to buy renewable energy on a cost-plus basis, roughly speaking. I knew many colleagues at our institute who'd signed up green tariffs, and then they were shocked to discover they were paying the price of gas. It didn't make sense to them. Why should it?
Absolutely. So in a previous life, I was representative for a part of the UK called Margate and Ramsgate. And the average wage there was £16,500 a year. So just think about that. So every single pound that a customer was spending, they knew exactly what they were doing with it. They were the smartest consumers ever. Why was the energy bill so toxic? It was so toxic because it was volatile. Every other bill came in at a fixed price with a clarity of the future. And what we've got with energy is it is a toxic bill because of its volatility. Now, we have fixed prices because that's what the contracts for difference have done, fix the price of the capital that's required to unlock the commodity. We should start passing that through. And once you get certainty of price and the lack of volatility, you actually have a reference price by which you might decide you want to put triple glazing in, or a reference price that you want to put more efficiency into your manufacturing process. The problem with the volatility is there's no reference price on what you are investing in efficiency. So we've got, in many ways, the worst of all worlds. We have getting a volatile price when actually government on our behalf, we have contracted on a contracted price, on a fixed cost. And in addition to that, we are expected as customers to manage global variabilities. This doesn't strike me as a homegrown domestic energy supply, happens to be low carbon, happens to be very important in terms of climate change. But that is what we have, and we're not exploiting it or delivering the benefits back to customers.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of additional things to say about this, because obviously, if it were simple, the government might have made more steps towards something like this. The reaction from economists tends to be, oh, but it's intrinsically inefficient to split up a market this way. They're all producing electrons. Why would you ever want to split that? And I think that actually it's worth a couple of remarks about this, right? The first is actually because we've recognized the economics of renewables are fundamentally different, capital intensive, certainty for the investors is actually very valuable. It makes the capital a lot cheaper.
Hugely valuable,
it's really important.
Very attractive.
We have already split the market between consumers and producers, which is not normally what you'd call an effective market. Now, I think the proposition around, in effect, a renewables-based power pool that was accessible directly to customers is actually, is it time we reconnected what is now half of our generation, or at least major parts of it, some are actually coming off their support contracts, to generators. I think one other point about this instinctive reaction from many economists, it's inefficient to split a market, it's all electrons, it's all the same, it all should have the same price, it's what I called once, slight tongue-in-cheek, the pear apple market. You say, we've got a product called a pear apple. It's very simple. And actually, they can all look pretty much the same. Certain sorts of pears and apples, very difficult to distinguish, similar nutritional. You say it's a unified market. Be dumb to separate, to split it, be inefficient. And then you actually look and think, under some circumstances, you get a drought or a shortage of pears or some whatever, price shoots up. Should everybody be happy paying that price then for apples as well because it's a unified market? So absolutely, it depends. What do you mean by the same commodity? And frankly, renewables and fossil fuel generated electricity, in my mind, are not the same commodity. And that's the
But they're not
mindset we've been trapped
generated
in.
by the same technology. They don't look the same. They don't behave the same.
No.
But we have conflated them to make economists happy, right? Now, I love economists. I don't know, Michael, are you an economist?
I never know. I'm sometimes called an interdisciplinary economist, whatever that is.
Now, that sounds very smart. I think that we rely far too much on economists rather than business model developers and actually understanding how we get the most out of systems and supply chains. Again, one of my big sort of gripes about the sector is we look technology by technology. So I totally agree with you that we should separate the apples and pears. But then let's look at the whole supply chain, because we've contracted all this fantastic offshore wind. And let's be frank, we are global leaders in this technology, and we should be very proud of that. But we forgot to build the roads to the farms. How could we, with quite a centralized mentality, forget to build the transmission lines to take the energy from the generators? We haven't been great at this central planning, and we haven't been very strategic and missed some big issues. So I think that we need to be much better at optimizing the fixed assets and the fixed commodity prices that we've got. I'm pleased that we're moving on the transmission side. But there is then one very, very large part of this, and as an economist, this would please you, and that is supply and demand are equal in markets. And this is a sector that has not looked at the demand side in any detail whatsoever. You rightly said about retailers, the dumb customer. There's actually a story of recently a supplier going into our regulator and saying, I've got 2.5 million MPAN numbers. Right? I'm sure nobody really knows what an MPAN number is. It is a meter point, but maybe, and was corrected very strongly, that actually this is called a customer. So even customers, human beings, turn into technology in the energy sector. But when we start to look at this whole area of demand in a renewable sector, there should be so much more rewards flowing to the demand side, from the flexibility markets, from efficiency, from new energy services. And I think that we could optimize a lot of the energy system, reduce system costs, if what we did was invest as much time and, to be frank, Michael, as much money in the demand side. Because I think that what we haven't done is understood that they are equal. They're equal in the physics as well.
Well, I think the point about the customers and their role in the system relates very directly to what we were saying earlier about last century's energy system. Because when effectively all electricity was made in pretty much the same way, there's an argument to say that the customers had very limited
vanilla customers,
say. But that's not the case now. The striking thing, obviously, is renewable energy has all the benefits you've touched on, but it has the big other factor that most of it is variable. And that means actually it is another angle on how the system is changing and what the possible roles of customers could be. So we did research at our institute looking only 5 years ahead.
Yes.
At if we get close to the targets being laid out, and we've now just had a successful auction on wind energy and renewables more generally, you very quickly start entering periods where some of the time you've got more electricity from the combination of renewables and nuclear than demand. And sometimes you've got a lot less. Now, that starts to shape interesting questions about what you refer to as flexibility, which in geekland means the ability to shift power between hours or longer periods or between places. And a lot of that discussion has focused on lots of batteries connected to the system.
Yeah.
And then some academics looking up hydrogen storage for interseasonal. Well, in between that, there's this huge range of possible flexibility.
Of course.
Some of which can be connected directly to the grid at scale, but a lot of it could be sitting in your home or in your factory.
Can I just say that? I mean, the company called OMI, which is an EV charging company, has just gone into the capacity market with 350,000 EV cars.
Yeah.
Right? So we have got this. I always use my analogy about fridges. If you didn't have a fridge in your home, supermarkets would have to be 4 times the size they are today, and we'd have to build an extra motorway on a lane on every single motorway. That is the same thing as having distributed storage, distributed flexibility and energy. And we need to understand that is going to be as valuable as the auctions for offshore wind. This is a total change in the attitudes that are required to understand this new system going forward, as you rightly say.
And maybe one final remark on that flexibility from the consumer standpoint. For those who have or considering an electric vehicle, if you had an interruption, you had it set up in the right way, or somebody paid you to do so,
it's great.
You have several days to a week of your household electricity consumption sitting on wheels outside.
What is not to like? I mean, it's a lot. This is really looking at the democratization of energy too. But we do need to give more rewards to customers for their flexibility, because they should be rewarded for the whole system cost.
Absolutely.
Or value.
Final remark, I know one other company that was creating a business around multi-storey car parks, where if you plug in your electric vehicle, you park for free, because selling that flexibility just a little bit on the margin back to the grid was more valuable than the parking space.
I love it. And customers would love it. This whole issue around customers and customers' rewards and customers feeling the decarbonisation sort of dividend that is so important, it's not really coming through. And we have got quite a problem now with sort of political fragmentation, all sorts of, I mean, obviously there is the sort of the Trump administration on one hand. We have got Reform and the Conservatives rowing back on the net zero objectives. I just feel at the moment that we've got to be quite robust about what the destination of a renewable system looks like and what the benefits are. There seems to be some interesting ideas out there that gas is going to be go for gas, and that's going to be the answer to our energy security and also cost of energy. I mean, you've been looking at this quite a lot, Michael. I just wondered, there was a report, wasn't there, from the Tony Blair Institute that came out?
Yes, and that was there have been some strange contributions in this debate, which sometimes make interesting points. But an underlying theme that seems to be being pushed in certain areas is, the most recent auctions of renewable energy weren't as cheap as they were, so maybe we should slow down on that and go back and revisit more gas or nuclear. And I look at this and think, well, hang on a minute. Sorry, but I mean, first of all, we touched briefly on nuclear. I'd love it if nuclear worked better. We've been trying to do that for many decades. So far, very little evidence. Currently, the Hinkley Point station has been about 25 years since inception, over a decade since contract. We're still waiting to come online, and the cost is huge.
I think you're going to have to invest in candles before you can absolutely rely that we're going to have a substantial nuclear fleet.
Well, Boris Johnson famously said, we're going to have a nuclear power station, a new one every year. And I know an old colleague of mine, even older, I should say, he said, yeah, I've heard that at least a dozen times before over the last couple of decades. It's completely that's not the way that industry has been able to deliver so far. There are some other hopes, some other technologies hope. But if we put that aside for a moment, the interesting issue was this sort of emergence of a narrative around gas. Mm-hmm. And let's be clear, gas has a really important role on the system. If we didn't have it, the lights would go out. We have 30 gigawatts of gas power stations at the moment. That's quite a lot. That is not far short of the average annual demand. And actually, nobody who looks seriously at the last few years can deny that it is gas that drove the price crisis for consumers.
Absolutely.
That is unambiguous. So this emerging narrative from some quarters, oh, well, you should actually have more gas, is a little bit strange, particularly because it seems to fall into a pattern I'm observing. When there was maybe a month ago, a lot of headlines about the cost of net zero, right? Mm-hmm. And you look at it and it was something about the cost of investing in all that we would need for a totally renewables dominated system without any mention about the cost of any alternative, like keeping your lights on in, Oh,
I agree.
Totally relying on fossil fuels. The cost of gas plants now, last month's statistics were the cost of a new gas plant is unambiguously more expensive even than offshore wind, which is big complicated machinery in the North Sea.
Yeah.
So the idea that, some of this renewables, actually, they've stopped getting cheaper, it's like, yes. And everything else has got even more expensive because that's the nature of what's been going on in the global economy over the last couple of years.
Yeah. Let's look at this counterfactual. Let's sort of examine it. Okay, fine. We go for gas. Fantastic. That would make Mr. Farage very happy, and obviously picking up on some of the pieces out of the Tony Blair Institute thing. Let's go for gas. I think we have got about 25% of our gas fleet coming offline in 2031, another 25% towards 2035, right? We're going to have to replace that. So the cost of that, from absolutely, as you say, is more expensive than offshore wind. But waiting for the turbines, the supply chain, at the moment, the supply chain it's a 10-year wait for turbines. So do you think that it would be sensible to put our energy security in a very volatile supply chain that is going to be is facing very significant inflation? And we're going to have to replace existing turbines, existing plant, not adding more. So this is, for me, is a real problem about energy security. And seriously, those people who are really pushing this agenda, I would invest in candles. I mean, this is a moment where we have got to look at the time frame. Last week, there was a very interesting piece by Catherine McGregor, who's chief executive of Engie. And she was saying that the big solar and wind programs that she's doing are completing in 3 years. And then she's comparing this to gas, and she's in the gas business as well. And she said very clearly, it's 7 to 10 years to build a gas-fired power station. Yeah. So even if the cost was the same, we have got a major energy security issue. We need generation as quickly as possible on the system. And as we've got these great assets, happens to be the North Sea, happens to be, a very good sort of windy area that we luckily live in, we have got the opportunity. And we have a global supply chain here in the UK delivering jobs to people today.
Yeah. There's no question the UK is pretty blessed by its wind resources and has done very well in engineering the offshore wind.
Absolutely.
Let me unpick aspects of this gas story a bit more because it is really important to get it right. As said, we still rely on gas to keep the lights on when there's insufficient renewables. A number of those plants are getting older. We have one other bit of big inertia in the system, which is the connection rights for a potential new gas plant, for some of the other sort of whole new greenfield things, as we know, notoriously take long. So some of those plants may be extended. Some we may be able to refurbish much more quickly or cheaply than new. That seemed to be the first place to look. What this, though, points to, I think, is the centrality of the flexibility debate at both ends. In other words, periods of surplus renewables, periods of deficit. What do we do? The obvious answer is storage. Storage comes in many forms. And I think that is the area where, frankly, Laura, every week on my news feed, I get another couple of ideas about new and novel storage technologies for various durations. It's absolutely fascinating. It's technology's paradise. But at the moment, we do risk being stuck in a world where it's sort of, there's a big battery industry, fine, great, getting ever better. There are people looking at hydrogen, which, could happen, but it's probably not a big player in the electricity system at scale for various reasons. We need far more attention, far more innovation in this plethora of technology options for medium duration storage on the system. Some of that will be on the consumer side, some other bits of the industry. And I think, to me, that's one of the big gaps in the policy landscape. Yeah.
I agree. And also, I would like us to start contesting a pound spent. So do you spend £1 on offshore wind, on network upgrade, or on self-generation? Now, I chair something called Electrify Industry, and the majority of manufacturers want to do self-generation. There was the chief executive of the Associated British Ports. He wants to put a massive amount of wind and solar on Tilbury Port, right, which is just a huge site. I mean, it's the site of a large town. What is he having problems with? Planning, permitting, connecting, right? These are people who can start, in many ways, taking the strain off the main system, developing their own assets, and they will do that at their own cost. And that starts to also ensure that we are spending that pound in the most efficient place. And I think that we should be looking a lot more at support, actually, not just financial, but sort of planning and permitting and connecting support for industry to actually start self-generating. If you're not running your factory at the weekends, you can export it to the local village, town, swimming pool, etc. So there's a lot more capacity that we've got in the system, or a lot more potential than just looking at this sort of the vanilla option, which is offshore wind, grid scale battery, network upgrade, and then an MPAN number.
Yes. You touched on the politics just then. Let me say a bit more about that, because I think this is important to deconstruct. Obviously, there are a bundle of questions about why are we having this weird resurgence in narratives that, as analysts, we think just don't really make sense. And I won't go into what's driving that per se. But in terms of public engagement and a positive understanding of the energy transition, I think there are 3 or 4 elements we can flag. One we touched on earlier, which is a bit more and easier direct access to pools of renewable at cost plus basis, obviously reflecting the transmission charges, etc. But that still looks both more certain, more confident, and cheaper than what consumers are paying now. And people talked, the cost has gone up a little bit. Even the offshore was about £90 a megawatt hour.
Yep.
Customers are paying, 300 or 30 pence a unit. So there's a lot of stuff in between. So a bit more direct access, bit more awareness and direct access to those economic benefits. Second, I think what you've said about, as an active consumer, you can benefit from aspects of this transition. You are, in effect, can become a part of the system, and particularly, most obviously for many companies, have actually quite a lot to offer. I think also some element of recognizing that, if you're in a region that's got a lot of wind energy, you've actually got sources of cheap power there. Yeah. And at the moment, the system doesn't facilitate access to that. But finally, politics is about narratives. I
agree.
And I think in a way we risk being, you and I, Laura, are both geeks, right?
Exactly.
We're not always that great at narratives.
We're geeking away.
There is a geopolitical struggle over the narratives now.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
Europe needs to carve its own way, but the context we're in is, to be blunt, as far as I can see, a Trump administration which is desperately trying to go back to last century's technologies and systems and mindsets. And I do not think the future lies that way. It wants to become a petrostate in a century where I think the petrostate is going to become out of date for mental reasons. Meanwhile, in China, you've got the emergence of what people are now calling the electrostate.
Yes, I agree.
China now has more electric-intensive economy than almost any other economy on the planet, because they're rapidly electrifying transport, because, again, that's turning out to be cheaper and more efficient. And they've invested heavily in a whole range of technologies incredibly effectively. And I think that our task in UK and Europe is actually to chart our way to an effectively domestically grounded good supply chain to become an effectively completing electrostate.
Yes.
That, I think, is where the energy future lies.
I totally agree. And we've got the offshore wind to do that. I totally agree with you about narrative. I also think that there is a fundamental, coming back to this is a 35-year-old system, right? And the way the commercial arrangements have been designed have not changed in 35 years. I do not know any other sector that has stayed still for so long. And really, it's a reflection actually of our regulator as well as the suppliers themselves. Firstly, the question, do you want to buy a kilowatt hour? Do you know what a kilowatt hour is? Do you care what a kilowatt hour is? We are trying to turn our customers into electrical engineers when actually all they want to do is turn on the bloody lights. Excuse my language, right? What they need new business propositions. They need things that thrill them. I'm not totally overexcited or even know what data I consume on my mobile phone or how many minutes I talk to anybody. I used to a long time ago when that was the way it was sold. It's just given to me as a package. Now, why are we not conflating assets with energy? So I would like to lease an EV car with 300 miles embedded in it. I know miles, I don't know kilowatts, and I certainly won't do the conversion. So I just want to know I've got 300 miles in it, right? If I need to top up, yes, well, I'll have to pay a little bit more. But everything is taken away from me. What do I want? I want heat as a service. I want to know that when I walk into the house, whatever, day or night, anyway, it is 18 degrees or whatever. But I also do night shifts. So I don't need it in the night, but I need it in the day. I set my preferences. Somebody delivers it for me. We need to actually really innovate in the retail side. We constantly talk, and I chair the innovation task force for the networks, right? Constantly talking about the networks and the system. Where the innovation is really needed is at that retail proposition, where actually the energy becomes the least important element of it. The experience becomes important. And I think we can change the perception about decarbonisation through much, much more efficient, effective, and enticing business propositions, rather than trying to get everyone to become an electrical engineer. Now, that requires fundamental change to our regulation. It requires a much more innovation and new players in the sector. And this is where just to give you an example, there's a company that turns social housing into power stations, retrofits them, everyone's bill goes down by 30%, and then exports through PV, heat pump, battery, and some EV charging to the grid, and the local authority gets a long-term revenue. Because this company doesn't offer universal service to anybody, they end up having to pay an energy supplier 5 to 7% for doing nothing, because this company does the customer service and does the billing. We have got to open this market up.
I mean, if I could draw you out a little bit more there, Laura, it sounds like you have frustrations with government policy around this sector. And if I maybe just flag a context also for listeners, which is that for more than 4 years ago, if I'm right counting, the government launched something called the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements. And actually, they also launched a retail market review. And at one point, I was making a case in the context of the first of those, the REMA process, about the role of customers. And they said, oh, no, there's a separate review going on about retail market.
You can't.
I mean, I have my own sort of sense of how things have or have not happened after 4 years of government review of the sector. What's your take on this?
Well, I kept on asking the minister from the previous government, what are you trying to achieve? And I never really got an answer of what they wanted the market to do. So there has been a little bit of a religion around markets, particularly in the energy sector. But a market has no purpose unless you program it for an outcome. And what they were trying to do, in my view, was to, in some ways, just layer on a review reformed market arrangement rather than looking at, in many ways, the commercial arrangements that sit underneath it. And I think it was the most frustrating period for everybody. It got hijacked by one issue, to be frank. There were one or two really good things in it, not least your green pool concept, which suddenly got sort of sidelined because everyone was talking about locational pricing. This sector, I am not frustrated. I am very encouraged by a government that is really driving things forward. But I am frustrated that we still don't realise that the retail market is broken and absolutely has to determine the rest of the market reform going through the system. I'm frustrated that we are, exactly as you said earlier, we're putting baubles onto the Christmas tree and they're all different colours. And actually, we're now getting to a Christmas tree that's about to fall over because the amount of layers we've put on top of the system, rather than doing some very, very aggressive housekeeping, reconfigure both the retail market, but also the market arrangements for a new system and ensure that we are getting rid of a lot of inefficiencies that have cropped up for over years within the system, whether that be standards, voltage, all of this stuff. There just needs to be a lot more housekeeping, and we need to get to, in some ways, back to basics, look at the system as it is, not as it was, reconfigure it.
Yeah. I think there may be some areas of the system also where some of the players have got better at almost playing the system. And you and I once talked about some of the trading houses and the amount that they've made people in markets where it's not entirely obvious how much value is added.
Michael, just coming back on that, I mean, when you start to look at it, retailers are not making any money. Generators aren't making very much money. Nobody is really making any money, but there seems to be a lot of money in the system. And where is that money actually? Who is actually making that money? We have created such a complex system that the gaming of the system has become the profitable part of it. Would you not? I mean,
I fear you're right about important element. I mean, let's bear in mind, you refer to a market leading program. Of course, the traditional market is simply individual customers go to place and meet individual producers and they like and buy what they see. We're a million miles from that, partly because, of course, it has to be a regulated sector in the sense of networks to carry, etc. But it does seem we've lost sight of some of that. But let me just pick up your question about this overall system and the nature of the processes we've been through. Because what has struck me was we've had, let's face it, a government elected with a big majority, an ambitious minister, very ambitious Secretary of State,
and somebody who really knows
the sector at the time of an ongoing government review. And yet it still seems that we have the ambition and objectives, but almost all of the decisions that were, offered at the beginning of the process, arguing we needed major change, have really come out with quite incremental stuff. There's a lot of resistance to anything fundamentally changing in how we've organised the system, isn't there? Are there ways of manoeuvring around that?
There hasn't been fundamental change, but I would question the fact that they had a clear destination. I'm still not clear what the process was trying to get to. If what you're trying to do is to optimise the system and to in some ways push the peaks out, right, you have a very different market system than if what you're trying to do is to create volatility to unlock technologies. And what we have looked at is we've tried to impose markets right the way through the system, rather than saying, actually, some of these commercial arrangements need to be contracted. Some of them can be traded. But if you look at other markets similar, and I know I bang on about the food sector, but actually these are contracted very far in advance. We have wheat farms and we end up we have 2 wheat crops a year and we eat bread every day. Now that is because a system has optimized it and has actually flattened the volatility not exacerbated it. And I think sometimes we look at markets and they don't necessarily deliver us the certainty or the cost, the cost benefits. But some trader is often doing extremely well.
Some of them are indeed.
Michael, I mean, you did a fantastic event before Christmas, which really pulled together all the different thinkers around market reform going forward. And I just wondered where you think government is and whether they appear to be saying that they're going to kickstart a new process. Let's hope it's not 4 years. Let's hope it is clear about what it's trying to achieve. But it was a really great event. So what came from that you're moving forward on?
Well, thanks, Laura. I think, first of all, the context for listeners, it was all following on this enormous bun fight in the sector about locational pricing or not. Should consumers in different parts of the system, in different regions of the UK, pay different prices reflecting the local cost of generation? And at the end of the day, the decision was not to. And we'd seen this coming. It was a massive fight. And to be honest, it was probably the research sector had said all of it was going to say on this. What we did do was convene a major workshop to say, okay, there has been a decision. Now what are the options? Because we know
what next?
Where things are located in this new world of this new electricity system really does matter. Where generation is located, where demand is located, will be of economic significance. And so what are the options? And what we did was we got together about 80 people, many round small tables, a set of issues, set of options discussing. I think a couple of things really came out of that. One was I was astonished at how many people said, we wish we'd had more events like that along the way. It might have stopped.
Can I tell you, I thought there was very little consultation. I mean, proper deep conversation about what they were trying to do. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I mean, even people who'd been in warring factions on this were at the table and saying, well, yeah, actually, we kind of agree on quite a lot of issues here. So I think process matters and the ability somehow to engage people with different interests, and objectively they know it, they're smart, they can recognise that and discuss, okay, but there's a bigger problem here we're all trying to find solutions to. So just that process insight was one thing. Substance-wise, I think what really came out was there are quite a lot of levers the government can pull to influence where stuff, particularly generation, is located in relation to networks. And in a way, that is valuable because markets are not always good at solving coordination problems like between networks and generation. And it may be the right solution to say government has a stronger hand in that coordination problem. However, it's a lot more difficult with respect to demand, most sources of demand. And it's even more difficult with respect to how you operate stuff. Once you have got a facility located, or major storage plant in a certain location where there's network constraints, if it's not seeing an electricity price which reflects the value or the cost of the constraint, etc., you've got a real problem trying to engineer that through more central planning. So our sense was that the government can solve half of the problem without locational pricing, but somehow it does have to work out how to get real locational signals so that consumers can benefit from the kind of things you were talking about earlier. Now, we were originally promised the government's follow-up on reform national pricing in January, then it was February, now it's March. That tells you they're having real problems coming up with options that are going to work. So we are ourselves looking at some options. Maybe you can have a slice of the market which does respond more to locational signals that encourages the kind of flexibility we need. Because again, it's not like you want to transform overnight for the whole system is suddenly magically flexible. No, it's not the nature of it. It is how do we navigate our way towards the kind of radically different future that you've been outlining.
Yeah. I think it was a great event and I really look forward to the work that you're going to do going forward on it.
It was published last week, by the way. So the report of the workshop's out for anyone who wants to know it.
Your participation in the future is going to be really important in how this is framed and how the government takes this forward. So I really look forward to hearing more about what you and UCL are going to be doing in that area.
Thank you very much. I'm going to raise one other flag for the work coming down the track. There are a number of things going on. One, that I think the advantage of academia, you sometimes think ahead and think about what are some of the issues that people haven't yet focused on because they're so obsessed with the current debates. And one of those is, do you know what? In little over a year now, we've got 5 gigawatts of renewable energy coming off its support
yes.
contracts.
No, absolutely.
And it is very unclear what's going to happen to some of it. And that is something where we think there's a lot of potential. It can be and should be an illustration of the benefits of upfront investment in renewables, which of course can last longer than their support contracts and are then incredibly cheap to run potentially, because the wind and the sun are kind of free. So once you've built the assets, you are building the foundations for a very cheap energy future. And that is, I think, what we really now need to start focusing on.
As I always say, I like to plan from the future.
There we go.
Nice
Thank you
to
very
talk
much.
to you. Lovely to talk to you, Michael.
Great to talk. Thanks, Laura.